Internets, what up? It's your boy B Austin, War Room Sports, the Hot Block Commander, aka Angry Negro. Forgive me, I planned on making this video quite some time ago. There's a lot on my heart as we traverse these interesting times. I bounce back and forth between apathy or something that resembles apathy and tears of pain and frustration. I believe that in America, you are able to ignore a lot of things and place your energies into working your job, plying your trade, managing your career, incurring debt, paying for said debt, living in your house, driving your car, shopping at your mall, and a lot of the things that are wrong with the world, we're able to ignore. We're able to ignore them. I'm plenty guilty of it. George Floyd is the proverbial straw, I guess, that has broken the camel's back, so to speak. So, this is my ramblings and thoughts. My initial intention of this video was to talk about how Drew Brees and Jack Fromm, is that the dude's name, man? He's the backup quarterback cat. Uh, yeah, I think his name is Fromm. That's sad. He's a bum and a backup, so I'm not too. I think it's Jake. No, it's Jake. Jake Fromm. So, how Drew Brees' sentiments and Jake Fromm's joke on Twitter that was captured from more than a year ago is a perfect example of white supremacy and racism in America. Because, see, we have sometimes this misconception that, racism leans more towards wearing a white dunce cap or carrying a Confederate flag, or maybe even being a Tea Partier, or I don't know, a president of the United States. I don't know. I don't know what in all cases what your ideal racist looks like. But if we kind of talk about what racism is, you have four dimensions, and these are not my definitions or thoughts, but they are definitions and thoughts that I found to be very compelling and pertinent. You have institutional racism, which is policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workplace or an organization or an institution. That's institutional racism. You have structural racism, which is multiple institutions collectively upholding racist policies and practices, i.e., a society. And you have interpersonal racism, which is racist acts and microaggressions carried out from one person to another. And those microaggressions don't have to be overt, they can be covert. And here's the big one: do they always have to be conscious? Could they be unconscious? Could it be your subconscious? I don't know, but those are questions that we should look at. We should try and answer. The last is internalized. The subtle and overt messages that reinforce negative beliefs and self-hatred in individuals. So yes, it's possible to be racist against oneself, against one's own people. cause and effect. What causes that? What's the effect? What's the cause of all of these forms of racism? Institutional, structural, interpersonal, internalized. What are the causes and what are the effects? What causes Jake Fromm to say, I believe only elite white people should own guns? Essentially, that's we know that's anti-constitutional, right? So we have a ton of people that you know take issue with kneeling and the flag and anything that questions America's integrity and commitment to humanity and human rights. Well, Jake Fromm in his joke essentially said he's against the Second Amendment for all. And by putting ha 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 at the end of it, there are those that are giving him a pass or the excuse. He was just a kid. He's just making a joke. And I believe that, that's, he was just a kid and he was just making a joke. But in every joke, there's truth. And so coming forth from that joke, you get to peer into, I believe, portion of his culture, who he is, where he's coming from. I don't think that just because he was joking, that that somehow means it isn't truly what he believes. And why I characterize that as the definition of racism is if we go back to the origins of this country and the wonderful tenets that it's built on, freedom for all, justice for all, land of the free, home of the brave, and all of those mantras and things that speak to the constitutional rights given to human beings. It was really for only the elite white folks. It wasn't meant for black people. It wasn't meant for and Native Americans. It wasn't meant for anyone but white people. Whether you want to talk about the founding fathers, George Washington, who was a slave owner, Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, and also pedophile, 14-year-old black girl that he brought across state lines and against her will. That's a whole nother conversation. But if you look at the very root of this country, the rights that were given by the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, those things were for the elite white people that Jake Fromm is referencing. And I certainly don't believe, and I wouldn't indict that young man. And I don't think that he was thinking that deeply. I think it was subconsciously he sort of injected that into the joke, and it characterized exactly what the problem is in the way that America was built. It was built on white supremacy. It was built on racism. And Jake Fromm, in his joke, in his tweet, I think he captured that. I think he actually captured it. Now, the reason that I bring Drew Brees up, and we've talked about him on the podcast, we've talked about him on a few good minutes here on the channel. I like to bring him back up because for so long it has been shared that the protests, even prior to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, the protests are about racism, institutional racism within American law enforcement, which we heard from Attorney General Anthony Barr stating clearly and concisely that there is no racial bias or racism within American law enforcement. I think he was speaking not only for the federal and the state level, but even the local levels. He was. I don't know how he would be able to speak for that many police forces, but he summarily dismissed it. Protesting against police brutality in African American and Latino communities has existed for decades, decades. And when Colin Kaepernick decided to take the knee, He succinctly and specifically articulated why, what it was for, how he arrived at that particular form of protest. He stated that. And the large segment of the American population, white people, you, I'm speaking to you, he said, "No, you're desecrating the flag. You're disrespecting our veterans. You're completely out of line." Even hearing from the President of the United States. Drew Brees and those that you speak for, you decided to completely ignore cause of the protest. Completely ignore it and interpret the effect from your perspective, which is disrespect of servicemen and women and disrespect of the flag. You're controlling the narrative. You're pushing, you're taking his message and perverting it into what you believe it is and totally ignoring what the issues are and what he's telling you the issues are. If that's not white privilege and call it what it is, racism, I don't know what is. I think Jake Fromm and Drew Brees give us two stellar examples of exactly what the problem is. Now, Drew Brees went on to speak, and I'm not quoting him verbatim, but he went on to speak of his grandfather and other men in his family that served in the United States military. I'm not sure when or what time frame he was referring to. He may have mentioned World War II, but if we go back to the inception of this nation and we look at the Revolutionary War and the Continental Army, there were literally slaves that fought for their slave masters' freedom, who were promised freedom for fighting in that war, and that was rescinded and taken back from them by the United States or members of the Continental Army. I think George Washington made that promise and then rescinded. The British, of course, went on and said, "Hey, Negroes, if you switch sides and fight for us, we can guarantee your freedom." And there was a song, I believe it was the Star Spangled Banner, the anthem. Um, the third stanza references that. It references that very fact. So there's an example of how African American military service was treated at the outset in the inception of the nation. If you move further into the Civil War, I'll skip the War of 1812. I'll skip the Mexican American war with in Texas. I'll skip all of that. I'll go to the Civil War. Black soldiers in the Union Army weren't allowed to be officers, weren't treated fairly, weren't given the same level of equipment, weren't given the same standards of uniform, but fought valiantly. If we fast forward to World War One, they were fighting side by side with European soldiers for a country where they were treated as third class citizens, third class still in the early 1900s. And you move to the middle of the 20th century, you have World War II, and the same things were going on. When Drew Brees' grandfather, I believe he referenced that, was fighting in World War II, you had valiant efforts by Negro units in the Army, Air Force, Marines, the Navy, fighting, segregated still, of course, only to come home and still be in a racist, overtly racist society where their rights and citizenship was still, I would say, third class. I wouldn't say second class. So how insulting even is it for someone to bring up their grandparents' service in the military in a time when African American men and women were fighting for the country that didn't treat them as anything more than third class citizens. I don't think Drew Brees really thought about it that far. Obviously, I certainly, I don't think that was his intention, but I think, if he'd have given it a little bit more thought, does it make sense to bring that up and throw that in the face of those that support Colin Kaepernick? Because historical context would tell you that you're talking about a period in time in history where the United States of America's civil and human rights record wasn't stellar. It always makes me laugh when I hear people say the whole "Make America Great Again," and I guess that is "Make America Great" for the people that count, to you, because if you look at the history holistically, and that's one of the issues I think that white people have with having this whole dialogue, is the America that you're taught about in school. And fair enough, every country paints itself as, amazing. It just isn't what it's painted to be in the history books, right? So it forces you to have a very honest and painful and uncomfortable conversation about the history of this country and where your behavior comes from as a part of a culture that is built into, or a culture that has institutional and structural racism built into it, right? So now your question is, am I racist? I don't want to have that conversation. It's uncomfortable for me. And look, you people are free. You people can, work and professionally and gain education and all of these wonderful things and rights that America affords all of its citizens now today, right? But the reality is, because the conversation hasn't happened, and an acknowledgement of what America is, that conversation doesn't occur. Here we are in 2020 with an arm of the government, law enforcement, constantly and consistently accused of racism as a part of its practices. I can't breathe. Black men and women murdered, treated like criminals. This is merely chickens coming home to roost, as they say. Now, my apathy comes from the fact that I've seen this over and over and over again in my more than 30 years of life. Haha. I just don't know. I never feel like we're going to turn the tide truly, because I don't feel as though the system is actually broken. I don't. I feel as though the system works perfectly for those that are the architects of that system. Notice I didn't say necessarily the engineers or the builders. That's a whole nother conversation. But the architects and those that kind of rule over that system, the elite class, as Jake Fromm would speak of, and honestly, that too is a conversation that goes beyond race and into classism, because he was taking a shot at those of you who are even are white folks in, you know, rural or working class America. I don't know that Jake would consider you to be elite. Maybe he would, based on the color of your skin. I don't know. Um, this, I, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because of my children. And that's why I said at the beginning of this video that sometimes I'm saddened almost to the point of tears, because I know how beautiful my children are, and how much I love them, and how dear they are to me. And to know that when they walk out into the world, that there are human beings, but not just human beings, a government, a system, a country that doesn't value them based on their culture, their ethnicity, and their skin color, still in 2020. To know that that exists, that still is not only a thing, but it's a core component, I believe, of American society. It's pain, man, because I don't know how to efficiently and effectively equip them to deal. I give them tools to hopefully one day become, entrepreneurs and captains of their own destiny with the ability to make and use the resource of money. I give them, culture, and they've traveled the world. They've been to three different continents, seven different countries. As of today, which it's June 11th, my son is 11, my daughter is 16. They're great kids, man. They're great kids. And so I'm not doing as I guess as much as I could. I'm not out on the streets. I'm not protesting. I'm not rioting. I'm not looting. I know my temperament, my ego demands that I win when tested, and that's not a healthy mix for coming home to my lovely wife and children. So I try and stay out of the fray, but I do believe in using my voice. And War Room Sports, as a company, we believe in using our voice. I don't know, man. I'm scared for the babies. I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. I do. This does feel different. This does feel different. It does feel different. I don't have any answers, y'all. I don't have any answers. But I thank you for your constant and continued support of War Room Sports. The opportunity to use sports as a medium to have social and civic dialogue and participate in the process of healing. And that healing and therapy doesn't even necessarily have to be a dialogue about, race or classism. It can be, any issue. It can be us just shooting the shit and talking sports, which we bring to you on a weekly basis. And we love your participation and support of that on our platforms, our Facebook, our Instagram, our TikTok. We appreciate you. And so, I don't know where this rant is going. I'm coming to the end of it. Do the best you can to be the best human being that you can and create a world that your children and my children can live in, exist, and be joyful. And one of us doesn't have to think about our children being George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Amadou Diallo or Trayvon Martin or Freddie Gray or Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland or Philando Castillo. It's tough. It's tough. We have a lot of difficult dialogue and conversations to have ahead. God bless.